Welcome to Metaconscious Leaders, where today we explore how leaders can step beyond business as usual and navigate the great challenges of our time. Today, I'm honoured to be joined by Guy Singh-Watson. Guy grew up on a farm in Devon, studied agricultural and forestry science at Oxford, worked in New York as a consultant before returning home with a vision for organic farming. He founded Riverford Organic Farmers, which grew to be a pioneering force in delivering organic vegetables directly to people's homes. Rather than accept the advances of investors who wanted to buy the business as it was so successful, Guy chose instead to sell the business into an employee ownership trust. Guy has twice been BBC Radio 4 Farmer of the Year and is described by some as Britain's most brutally honest and outspoken farmer, being a scathing critic of Brexit, a vocal member of Patriotic Millionaires UK, and advocating a wealth tax amongst many other socio-economic positions he talks openly about. Search in the media about Guy and you will find him talking plainly about matters of significance and importance for humanity and society. So Guy, thank you for putting your time aside to be our guest today on Metaconscious Leaders. Welcome.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Greg.
As I was saying a moment ago, Guy, I would really like to focus in on this conversation, particularly on your views of the importance of leadership in the wider context in business generally and even nationally, but also internationally, and the role it can play in this time of monumental challenge and change. But can we start with a précis of how you got to doing the extraordinary things that you've done? Can we start at the beginning with a short précis of your life, where you started, where you returned from New York to found Riverford Organics?
Okay, I was 26 when I came back. I thought I was just coming back for Christmas, having established that I was unemployable. That I really didn't like playing by other people's rules was really the problem, and that I felt what I was doing was morally bankrupt. I wanted to do something useful with my life. I wanted to be outside. I knew I had to be my own boss, and I came back for Christmas, and I had, whilst living in New York, spent a lot of time at a farmer's market on Union Square, and actually more and more time. I just love talking to the farmers rather than going to the office. And that was what inspired me when I got back to the farm, that I could sense as a consultant. I'd spent a lot of time looking for growth markets for companies whose products were kind of in decline. And, I could see that this was a growth market. My father had been producing a commodity all his life, the white stuff, milk, and had been, most definitely a price taker. And I wanted to farm, but I didn't want to farm like that. And anyway, I'd renounced my claim to the tenancy to my brother by leaving and jetting off to New York. Yeah, so anyway, that I can't, to be honest, a lot of the big decisions I've made in my life have been pretty knee-jerk, probably intuitive, but somehow I found myself out in the only flat field on the farm with a plough in January 1987, and that's how it started. Sowed some leeks and off we went. Didn't have a clue what I was doing. That was how it started.
So did you get the idea in New York then?
I think, I was kind of inspired by these farmers selling their produce, on Union Square, and hearing their stories, and I suppose witnessing the connection they were building with their customers. I have to say that all these sort of ethical stuff, be it social or environmental, came later. It probably was there somewhere lying, latent, but I wasn't conscious of it. I thought that this was a good business opportunity, and that fell in with my ambitions to come back to the farm and be outside and be my own boss and so on.
Right. So I've seen it written that you started with 3 acres and a wheelbarrow, delivering vegetables to friends. It sounds quite romantic.
Yeah. Unlike many companies that have their kind of creation myth, I would cite Innocent as that, that all started with Glastonbury and going around festivals selling smoothies. I'm damn sure that they didn't do very much of that. And I really did push that wheelbarrow across the field, fill it up with leeks, push it back, wash them, put them in my car and go and sell them. And that was the first 2 years of my life before I even had a tractor. Yeah, I borrowed my brother's tractor. But yeah, no, it was very, very hard work. For I would say the first 10 years, probably even 15, and then started getting, we're talking 70-hour weeks and, neglected families and so on, which I think so many people who start their own businesses do. But it was,
Yeah.
physically very hard as well. What actually drove me on, I'm fairly sure, having spent a fair amount of time in therapy, was a desperate need for my father's approval, who he was quite reluctant to show. I think he felt by withholding it, we'd work harder to achieve it or something. And in some ways, he was right. It's not the way I'd like to parent my children, but yeah. So I just had to, I just had this incredible drive to prove myself, if not to him, to the world. I don't know and I was borderline. I would say it was a kind of type of insanity, and it's a sort of insanity that I see in quite a lot of self-made entrepreneurs. There is a kind of madness behind it, which is revered in many ways. I think we have a almost ridiculous reverence for those who are good at making money in this country, but it comes with many costs.
Hmm. And so you, from that 10, 15 years of pushing a wheelbarrow, you then suddenly, abracadabra, have a business turning over many millions, delivering millions of veg baskets, veg boxes
It
across the
wasn't
country.
sudden, and it wasn't abracadabra. It was a hell of
Oh,
a
I
lot of
realise that. I'm
just
sure it wasn't.
incremental work.
I'm sure it wasn't. Yeah.
And, I think for the first 20 years, I did sit down and write it, and the compound growth rate was something like 50% a year or something, which is, anyone who has run a business will know that is absolutely exhausting. I mean, you can do it for a
Right.
year or two.
Yeah.
Obviously, those startups, that's their absolute dream, probably growing up, a lot faster than that. But to keep it going for, 15, 20 years, that is really, really tiring.
Okay. So you had the growth. You had the growth from the start, from the outset, did you? So you knew you were onto something, and that so long as you could make it to the next.
Yeah, I mean, I sold to local shops. They didn't really care whether it was organic at the start. So I had to explain what organic was to their customers, posters and so on. And then to local wholesalers who completely took my shirt, then to wholesalers in London, organic wholesalers. And eventually I ended up selling to supermarkets, never directly, through a packer. And they were all pretty awful in their own ways. And it wasn't until 1993, so I've been going, whatever that is, 18 years, that we actually packed and delivered our first vegetable box direct to consumer. And that was the start of, taking control of our own destiny, I suppose, being able to make, a reasonable level of profit. And yeah, being in control and having a secure future. Because I mean, during I suppose the 90s and then the noughties, the organic market was growing very fast. And to be honest, you didn't have to be very good at it to do okay. As all markets mature, they become more competitive, and the real crunch came in sort of 2007, 8, as I remember, when the supermarkets had bullied a lot of their conventional growers to convert some of their land to organic. And at that point, yeah, if you weren't really prepared to play by their rules, you were out of the door. But by that time, we were delivering direct to consumer. And I'm certainly very, very glad to have made that decision. So the real growth, I would say, and they started in 1993, and it was pretty much exponential through to 2007. I think from 2003, we'd more or less certainly abandoned supermarkets. We're probably selling a little bit to wholesalers and one or two shops, but 95% plus would be going direct to the consumer, which is where our strength has been. I do seem to have a sort of natural gift, I suppose, for, I'm going to say, storytelling, but marketing. All our marketing is around, being able to bring what we do to life through stories, and that has stood us in very good stead over the years. I think we have a fantastically strong and well-trusted brand. I mean, a brand that is based on sticking to what we do, knowing what we do, and being honest, not over-claiming, prepared to be a bit nuanced in terms of what we're doing and why we're doing it, not always the sort of black and white No, we're not going to abandon plastic completely tomorrow. No, we're not going to be net zero next year, because, those things would be virtually impossible to achieve. But we are going to move in that direction in an honest way. And I think that trust is very, very hard won, and and it is very highly valued within the business. I'm sure we'll come to it. I mean, after it became employee owned in 2018, well, fully employee owned a couple of years ago, but 74% employee owned in 2018. But I guess we'll come back to that.
We'll circle back to that in a moment, because this is Metaconscious Leaders. Leadership is a big topic for us. So you created something from the wheelbarrow onwards. I mean, you obviously weren't the only person involved. You obviously had a really good team of people around you. What part was your leadership in this? What kind of leader are you? And you've also spoken openly about your late in life autism diagnosis. How has this shaped in your style of leadership, in your view?
Okay. Well, I think I was definitely lead from the front, and it took me many years to appreciate that not everyone is like me, thank God, as someone said to me. And, I'm a very driven individual, and not great at work-life balance and so on, or I haven't been historically. And not everyone was like that. And I used to find that very frustrating that, that I had to base my business on that, other people would achieve something like between a third and 2/3 of what I would achieve. And that was very frustrating. And having to put the structures in place to make sure that at least I got that third, I found has been something that I found very, very difficult through my life. So I think in the early days, when I started, I was 26. I had very little self-awareness. I didn't understand the impact that I had on people. I probably had a degree of authenticity. I think I count honesty very dearly, and I think that is part of the autism that you referred to. I absolutely cannot understand how so many people in this world find it so easy to lie as a matter of routine. And I include around boardrooms and, in that. So, I find that very difficult. But I mean, as the years went by and as one marriage failed and, I had trouble with my children and trouble with my siblings, I ended up doing a fair amount of therapy, which I think has helped me become a bit more self-aware, to understand myself, what drives me, what is shaping the decisions that I make. And I think that has made me a better and perhaps even more significantly a safer leader than I was when I was just that blind, driven fool who I think those people can be incredibly dangerous. When I look around the world at the problems we have generated by the likes of, egomaniacs who are driven by, I don't know what, a desire to impress, get approval, get love. I don't know. Very often money becomes a substitute for all those things because that seems to be all that's valued in many areas. You only have to look around at the Putins, the Trumps and so on, and the absolute havoc that they cause in this world. Actually witnessing Boris Johnson's leadership style was incredibly sobering for me, because I did see, I saw there, in that rule breaking, nothing applies to me, absolute contempt for other people. I saw quite a lot of myself, and it made me really not want to be like that. And I think I have got slightly better at following rules post witnessing, his rise and fall. Yeah, so I do have quite strong, I do think if you find yourself in a position of power, I think it is incumbent upon you to really understand yourself, your motivations. If you're able to have that influence over other people, if you don't understand what it is you're doing and why you're making those decisions, you are not a safe leader. You may be successful commercially, and particularly in the short term. You may be successful in a trading environment as opposed to an environment where you actually generate something of genuine value. But if you're trying to build something for the long term, I think understanding what drives you is very important.
Yeah. Yeah. And authenticity is something which is probably writ through you like Brighton Rock, isn't it?
I think it is, and all my siblings too, actually. I mean, that was something that we were brought up with, a very strong set of values that came down from my parents. And they were the post-war generation. And when I hear people waving the flag, and come back to Boris Johnson on that, claiming that they are standing for the values that my parents fought for, they would have been absolutely horrified. That wasn't what they fought a world war for. They came out of it and they wanted to build a better world, a more inclusive world, a more egalitarian world that they wanted to chip away at this class structure that they'd grown up with and had been, privileged members of. And, those values rubbed off, trying to do something useful with your life, not just to yourself, but to other people as well. Those were, that rubbed off around the kitchen table every day, I suppose.
Yeah. So what then personally is important for you in life, and also, across into business?
Well, I do come back to and I think this may also be part of my autism, but just being valuable, doing something useful every day, and tangibly useful. I did feel today I had a fairly useless day, and I went out and picked some apples and some damsons for my wife's pub, before doing this interview and spending another hour talking. I mean, that sort of doing tangibly useful stuff is important to me. Obviously, from someone in my position, with 1,500 people working at Riverford now, that is not really the most useful thing I do, but it's still what I'd still have to do a little bit of
Right.
that.
Yeah.
And if I don't do that, I cannot be an authentic leader and communicator. I still have to have my hands in the dirt a bit, and I do. That honest toil, I think, keeps me sane, and it does also keep me honest.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So in 2018, I think it was, you acted on your strongly held beliefs by making the radical choice to redefine the future of Riverford. And instead of selling to investors or inviting investors in, you transferred ownership to the employees, making Riverford one of the UK's probably most significant employee-owned businesses. Why employee ownership? What values guided that decision?
Okay, I spent a lot of time when I'm out in the fields, hoeing up and down a row of lettuces, trying to work out how the world could be a better place. What would be a better kind of structure for society? And I think, as you said at the beginning, Greg, there's precious little that happens in this world that isn't in some way shaped by business or commercial imperative and so on. So, and that's what I was doing. I was in business. So how could I use that to shape a better world? And I have a serious problem with capitalism, particularly the capitalism that I have seen in shareholder capitalism, listed companies and so on, that over the last, I'm going to say post 1980. So it did start with Margaret Thatcher in this country and Friedman and so on. The idea that the only way you can organize things is by appealing to people's personal self-interest. One could say avarice or greed, is, I find, a deeply demeaning assumption and a wrong assumption. It happens to be the assumption that people who find their way at the top, climb their way to the top of the greasy pole and end up with the power, they tend to be the people for whom maybe it is important, or maybe it is that they are so insecure in other ways that only money is the only thing that they can be sure about. But for whatever reason, they have this distorted set of values which have distorted society in a way which I find absolutely abhorrent. The assumption that a doctor goes to work, a teacher goes to work, to make more money, that's their primary motivator, is just patently absurd. And I think if you talk to 70, 80% of people in this country, if you really had an in-depth conversation, you would come up with the same answer. It may be, obviously it is the case for a city trader, but I mean, they are a pretty weird breed and quite a small breed. And I think even most people who run substantial businesses, I mean, especially the people, I'm not talking about the finance director. I'm not talking about the person who has to deal with the shareholders. I'm talking about someone that actually gets stuff done in an efficient way. And they're normally engineers who are motivated by doing things well. That's the motivation. Yep. And which I think comes back to my thing of actually wanting to do something of value. And I don't think I'm that unusual in that. But I think the world has become incredibly distorted in this way that we can't even think of trying to appeal to other motivators. I mean, I'm a big fan of Dan Pink. I don't know whether you read any of his stuff. There's an 11-minute video on the RSA website on motivation, which I think is absolutely brilliant, where he argues, supported by many, many economists, that what motivates us is the desire for mastery, autonomy. So mastery, getting better at something, whether it's playing the guitar or designing something better, or in my case, growing a better lettuce. Autonomy, being able to actually have some say in how you do that, you go about do that, and purpose being that, you want that lettuce to be eaten by someone and enjoyed and hopefully not destroy the planet in doing it. Those are the three things that motivate, and there's loads of evidence to suggest that, and that money is an incredibly poor motivator. And I have seen this over and over and over again in my career, when we've done piecework in the fields. And, people end up having fights, I mean, people want to work in an agreeable way. And anyway, yeah, so I think, and of course it appealing to people's, the single lever of money appeals to a really lazy, bad manager. Who can't be bothered to do the hard work to actually understand, what complex human beings we are, and that there are, other levers to be pulled. But they involve much more work, yeah. So, as you can probably tell, I do have strong views about that. And I've been on almost, a 20-30 mission to try and prove that business can be done in another way. And I think we're doing pretty well, actually. We've weathered some storms as an employee-owned business, COVID being one of them, which we did. Everyone rose to the occasion. We did incredibly well, really looked after our staff, looked after our customers, and came out much stronger out of it, for instance.
I just want to include here a reference to some of the numbers, Guy. That this wasn't just a transaction that you did where you transferred ownership into an employee ownership trust, but you did it at a huge discount. So
yeah, well, Abel and Cole had just been sold. Who were actually a little bit smaller than us. I can't remember. They might have been bigger than us then. No one ever found out, but I think they sold for 35 million. Our accountants actually valued us at 22 million. I think we were significantly less profitable than them, which probably explains the difference. And many people find that difficult to understand, why you would sell something for 6 million that was worth 20. I just think, and as if, I mean, some people actually find it, I don't know whether to say threatening or morally offensive, but I mean, if you are deeply, deeply invested in, free market capitalism, the idea that someone would sell something for, a bit more than a quarter of what it's worth is hard to understand and perhaps a bit threatening. But and maybe they think I'm an idiot, but I think anyone who thinks 22 million is going to make you any happier than 3 million, I think they're the idiot. I really do. Yeah. So that's how we sold it, and I kept 26%. And I have to say, I was paid that money over 5 years, I think, and it could have been a lot longer, but we did very well, and they were able to pay me back very quickly. And then I sold the final 26%, just to give you all the numbers, full disclosure and all that. When I sold the first bit, I said, look, when I sell the final 26%, I really don't want there to be a discussion about the price. So let's just settle on it now. It's going to be 4 times EBITDA. And I'm guessing that most of your audience will understand what EBITDA is. It's profit and a little bit more added in. And so when I came to sell the shares, we'd had an incredibly profitable time during COVID, and I sold them, and that gave me, that's put me into a stratospheric area of wealth that I could never possibly have dreamt of. I can't even remember. It was another 8, 9, 10 million or something. Yeah. So, so I'm a very wealthy man.
I read.
Oh, you've got it, have you? Yeah. 9.8. That's right. Well, you can tell how little it matters to me because I can't even remember, so it makes no difference, and I am busy, spending that on projects that I hope will make the world a better place.
Just before we leave Riverford, though, how has the culture shifted in Riverford with this switch of ownership? Because it's quite seismic, isn't it?
Okay. Yeah, no, well, there's quite a lot there. And so stop me if I go on too much. I started talking about employee ownership it was the early 2000s. And I researched co-ops and visited a lot of other companies, a lot of co-ops, which I was quite drawn to. Actually, I was looking for a form of ownership that actually included customers, suppliers, and workers. but it was just too complicated, and I ended up with employee ownership. And it turned out, as we finally moved towards it, Charlotte, who was then our HR director, and Rob, our managing director, sat me down one day and said, "Come on, you've been talking about this for 10 years. Are we going to do it or what?" And I said, "Yes, we're going to do it." And they said, "Well, when are we going to do it?" And I said, "We're going to do it in the next 3 years." And we did. That must have been June 2015. However, it became apparent that when you become employee owned, there are 3 areas to be done. There's sort of governance. How do you set up your structure? How are you going to make your decisions and so on? And I can talk about that if you'd like, but it's a bit dull, to be honest. There's finance. How are you going to pay for it? And then there's culture, I would say. And the culture was, and normally is, I think, the most challenging
Yeah,
one,
agreed.
really. So if you're going to get what people talk about as the employee ownership dividend, that your staff are going to be more productive, give better customer service care, stay longer, and so on, all those things, a share in the profits might help a bit, but mostly that's going to be around culture, and mostly it's going to be around, if you're on the shop floor or in the fields, it's going to be how you are managed. And I can't quite remember how it happened, but we ended up working with a woman called Canada Gawler, who was an ex-opera director, actually, but had become a kind of management coach, working with some fairly high-powered people. I can't remember who introduced us, but she was just absolutely fantastic. And, seemed, very, very insightful, understood quite quickly what we needed. And I knew we needed some cultural change, but I thought it was mostly in middle management and downwards. And I thought it couldn't possibly be me, was the problem. Because we did have quite a, I look back on it now and I realize, we had quite a macho, bullying, not caring culture within the business, which I don't think we got a lot done, I suppose, but I look back on it with some embarrassment. And indeed, it did start with me, it turned out, and Canada pointed this out. Around some of my behaviors, which may be the sort of behaviors that are excusable in a maverick entrepreneur sort of thing. I think we do tend to put all that sort of stuff on a sort of pedestal that people, well, I'll come back to Boris Johnson again. That some of that behavior clearly isn't acceptable. And she sort of held the mirror up to me, and I think she was staggered by how quickly I changed, actually. And the most, when I got things wrong, was actually to acknowledge it and to apologize publicly and quickly, and she had urged me to be less often gratuitously offensive, which I think I am and probably still can be guilty of. And when I was, and I knew I'd been, to apologize publicly and quickly. And the first time I did that I'd said something, I'd gone too far on something, and the boardroom went on, we went on something, and I said, "Look, I just want to stop the meeting and say that I recognize I went too far there. It was too much, and I apologize." And there was a sort of silence around the boardroom table. And it was that moment was, I would say, when the culture changed, because then it no longer became permissible for other people to be bullies. Effectively, I'd been a bully. Really, I would never use the word then, but looking back, I was a bully. And the worst thing about my bullying was that it gave other people permission to bully. That was, and anyway, that changed really pretty quickly in a matter of months. And I'd say that was, so now we have a much more consultative. I mean, I think Rob is just inherently better at consultation than me by, a long way anyway. But the
Is
culture of
Rob
the business.
is
Rob is now our CEO. Yeah, has been for, I don't know, 10 years now or something. Anyway, it is a much more inclusive place to work. I think a happier place to work. People feel looked after. When we do the top 100 employee survey, our sort of my manager scores are, much better. We still got a way to go. It's not perfect. And, just becoming employee owned doesn't doesn't deliver that culture. You have to work at it. It can be a catalyst, to help you get it there. But, we live in farming is hard, it's a bloody hard graft.
yeah,
And, people have to work hard, and if they don't, you're going to go bust, So it is that's the reality of it out there in the fields and in the pack house and so on. So it is, to deliver that lovely, kind culture it's probably quite a hard sector to do. But I think we're doing pretty well. So, I'm really glad that we went through that sort of evolution, and I have some concerns now that we may almost have gone, in some ways, I don't know whether it's fair to say too far, but when in June the 6th, I think it was 2018, I gave my speech on Employee Ownership Day, and I said, I'm not worried that you're going to do something stupid, because I've done lots of stupid things. What I'm worried about is that you'll never do anything stupid, i.e. that you'll be so risk averse and so so hung up on, just doing what we do better, which they do it a lot better than they ever did in my day. But who will make the next big leap? Who will, start a vegetable box scheme when, it was completely flying in the face of every consumer trained in the country in 1993. So, who's going to do that? So if I have a concern, I mean, I think the culture is much, much better place to work. Really proud of it. I am a bit concerned about, the removal of that sort of entrepreneurial, innovative drive, being prepared to sort of break them quickly, hopefully cheaply, and move on to the next thing. That's the bit that I'm most worried about.
Yeah. So would you recommend employee ownership to other companies?
Well, definitely. Yes, I would. I mean, I'm not sure. In some instances, you probably can get quite close to the market value of your business. Probably a bit difficult if you've got a lot of assets. So it's certainly a lot easier if you have owners who are prepared to be patient in how long they're paid out over, and hopefully take a slightly lower stake as well. I mean, it is worth mentioning that the government has actually, I think it might have been going all the way back to Gordon Brown actually introduced a thing whereby you're exempt from capital gains tax, and the employees can get a profit share of up to, I think, about $3,500 or something tax free. So that's quite a significant sort of benefit that's helping. And I'm pretty sure that I really hope the capital gains tax go up to the same as your marginal rate of income tax at the autumn budget, which for most people in my position will be 45%. So that would then be a very, very significant incentive, I would say, for most people to consider it, at least. And if anyone is interested, I am always happy to talk about it and advise people on how to go about it. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that would be welcome by anybody who's considering it. Thank you for that.
I suppose let me just say why I would do it. I've seen so many people sell their businesses. I think I'm going to say everyone I know who has sold their business ends up in some way regretting it. Some of them trying to regain control of it in one way or another, which is almost always ugly, undignified, and seldom works. If you are an entrepreneur who has built something from scratch, this is like a child. I feel as strongly about it as I do about the future of my children. And I have said to have sold it to venture capitalists, as Abel and Cole was sold to venture capitalists, who destroyed it within 2 years because they didn't understand what the business was, what the relationship with the customer was, and so on. To do that would be like selling one of my children into prostitution. And that, I know that sounds like a strong thing, but that's how I really feel about it. And when I meet all the entrepreneurs who have built up these businesses, which are very personal to them, and sold them, they are normally depressed, bitter, very unhappy people. So, in fact, someone who advised us on our marketing through this, I've met lots of people like you, Guy. I call them the 3Ds. They're all divorced, dyslexic, and what was the other one? And depressed. Divorced, dyslexic, and depressed. I am dyslexic. I am now divorced. And I do occasionally suffer from depression, but there you go. We do seem to be a type. I probably overshared there, another autistic characteristic.
Oh, well, your honesty is refreshing and actually absolutely perfect, because these are the almost the kind of pitfalls and rewards of doing business and leadership in different ways. And what you're articulating here, I think, is something that is quite rare. And because it's rare, that there aren't many role models around for it. And I think even if people don't actually go through the process of doing what you've done, the mere knowledge of its impact and what you talked about there with culture and how your leadership style changed when you had a mirror held up to you, and the impact that had, the immediate it had, not just on the staff and the business, but on you personally.
Yes, it did. I think it made me. I think that process it certainly made me a better leader, and I think it made me a better father. It made me a better friend, and I feel I've learned all sorts of new skills over the last 10 years. I'm staggered that people actually even ask me for advice on emotional issues. I mean, that wouldn't have happened 10 years ago.
And you're happier for it.
Unquestionably, yeah. And also, I mean, I am very proud of Riverford. I mean, it's only 2 miles away down the valley. I walk down there once or twice a week and have lunch and meet people and stuff. And I'm immensely proud of what they're achieving. I mean, it's quite difficult for a founder to stay on in that capacity. I'm still a director, mostly non-executive, really. I still do quite a lot of the media stuff and write the newsletter and, do quite a lot of media work and still grow some vegetables. Normally when a founder, sells up or whatever, the best thing is they get out of the way. I mean, it's very seldom that it works to have this ongoing relationship. I feel it in myself. Oh God, I wouldn't have done it that way. And someone said, someone described founders as the danger is that they're applying yesterday's solutions to today's problems or something. I don't know. I mean, I still think I have an input to make, and I think most people at Riverford still think I do. I'm not saying I don't occasionally get frustrated with what they're doing, but I absolutely acknowledge that they're doing most of it a whole lot better than I ever could have done.
That's wonderful to hear. Can we just spend a couple of moments acknowledging the context of this conversation and the context that humanity is in at this point in time? What some describe as a meta crisis, these kind of intersecting or interconnected challenges across environment, economy, society, politics, health. You can name a few more. How do you interpret humanity's situation? Because as a farmer, you have a pretty good insight into some of the more direct consequences that we're experiencing.
Well, just practically and directly, climate change is here, and it's arrived a lot faster than anybody expected, certainly I think in the farming community, because it turns out that what impacts us is extreme events. So, we've just had, I don't know what, 4 or 5 months with barely no rainfall. And then in the last week, I think we have now had 6 inches now. I mean, it's absolute deluge. Really extraordinary circumstances that is having, mega impact on farming. So it's here, it's happening. And going a bit broader than that, what created it was avarice, capitalism, just an absolutely extraordinary lack of wisdom to use what we know sensibly to look after the planet for our children. So, we have had the most, unfortunately, as I've already said, the people who get to the top, the Elon Musks of this world, perhaps the Donald Trumps, you look at they are mad.
I've lost you, Guy.
Greg, I don't know what happened then.
Well, I think I would hazard a guess that was where Musk came in with his AI and cut the line.
Yeah, maybe it was. It was right then, wasn't it?
Those are not words.
No. Well, let's try and think of another example.
You won't have to go.
Do you want to ask me the question again? How do you want to pick that up?
Well, I think I think you'd pretty much done it, hadn't you?
I talked about climate change. I did want to say that I think we have a crisis in capitalism in that, and I would say the digital revolution now followed by AI has actually, far from democratizing the web, is just concentrating wealth and power in the hands of a small number of people. And who, all the signs are that they are going to use their influence in not very good ways. I mean, if the denial of climate change, or certainly the denial of that we should do anything about it, is, quite apart from the fact, I think that concentration of wealth, that grotesque inequality is, the planet cannot afford it. Those are the people who are creating climate change. But I just think it's socially toxic. And unfortunately, there is a lot of, historical data to suggest that in times of peace, it's almost inevitable that money will become concentrated in the hands of a small number of people. I mean, it's inevitable, isn't it? If you have assets and you charge rent on those assets, that rent allows you to buy more assets. The people who are paying the rent end up with less assets. You end up with, more inequality. And the only thing that changes that is a complete breakdown of society, be it in the form of a revolution or a war. And I don't think many of us want to see that. I certainly don't. I mean, revolutions never achieve what they set out to achieve. But I think we're living in really dangerous times. And I think the climate crisis is a result of avarice and refusal to, use our wisdom. It's a result of the wrong people getting to the top with just out of control egos and very little wisdom and very little balance in how they conduct their lives. Yeah, so we are in a crisis. And, I think we do need to get used to the idea that capitalism needs regulating, and the neoliberal economics has been, I think, it's certainly generated a lot of wealth, but a lot of wealth in the hands of a relatively small number of people. It hasn't been good for everyone else, and it certainly hasn't been good for our planet. And I think we need to get used to the idea that this needs a hell of a lot more regulation. But of course, the privileged are going to fight that regulation tooth and nail, and they are the ones who have the money, the power, and the influence. So I'm sorry to be a bit depressing on this, but I don't feel, I feel we've got a real crisis ahead of us, and I do really worry for my children.
Yeah, and the developments are happening. I mean, take technology, take AI. It's happening so rapidly that digesting the impact of AI on society, on digesting the impact of it across the board, doing that at the same time as addressing the issues that you're talking about is almost kind of mission impossible.
Well, yes. I mean, I'm sure AI, unquestionably has the possibility to massively improve our lives. I think it's highly dubious that it will,
It probably depends.
because, as I say, of this lack of collective wisdom amongst those who have the power and the influence.
Yeah, it probably depends upon the people who are controlling the AI, because it comes back to
Absolutely.
democracy that you were talking about. If you have AI in the hands of people who are not good actors, that's a very different scenario to it being in the hands of people who are working for a common good.
Yeah, well, if you look at the 10 richest people in the world I think there's one French industrialist or something, and the other 9 are all tech bros. And I wouldn't, from what I witness, I wouldn't trust, their judgment or their morality. I find it pretty scary.
So looking ahead and looking at a vision that we might give some energy to. So you've argued powerfully that business can be a force for good when it puts people and planet first, and when profit is seen as a means as opposed to an end. And Riverford, it's a certified B Corp. It's done all the things that it's done, and you can say that ethical leadership is what has headed it up. Not perfect leadership, but ethical leadership.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And so in practice, what is ethical leadership for you, and why is it so important at this time of monumental change, challenge, and opportunity?
Unfortunately, you can't measure everything with money, can you? I mean, we've yet really to have an effective way of measuring climate, environmental impact. I know we sort of have a carbon market, but really it's been around for 20 years and has made precious little progress. So I would say we are not, measuring climate change. And the idea that, and we're not in environmental impact and biodiversity, we have biodiversity net gain credits. But if you scratch under the surface of them and look at it, they're just a complete joke. I mean, that you're trying to monetize nature and whatever is exceedingly problematic. And so, how we're going to include those things into a model where money is king. It is really, really difficult. And any attempt I'm seeing, obviously the fossil fuel companies are fighting this tooth and nail, that we should, but were we to have a carbon tax, climate change would go away. If it was enough, probably $100 a ton plus, we would solve climate change in 5 years, certainly in a decade. We would get to a negative position. We have all the technologies, we know how to do it. It wouldn't make, when Stern wrote his report, must be 20 years ago, I think he thought it might cost 1% of GDP. They say it would be 4% GDP. Wouldn't we rather suffer 4% than have and I have a planet that's habitable for our children? You can still hear the birds sing. I don't know. I'm sure I would. And anyway, and I think most people would. So, capitalism just shows all the signs of, it shows no signs of being able to incorporate that into its model. And we are told that this will happen through informed consumers / citizens making better decisions, buying products that have a lower environmental impact and so on. I mean, show me some evidence of that. All that happens is that people just manage their brands to create the right impression, which is always cheaper than doing the right thing. I mean, if you look back at all the companies that said they were going to be net zero by I think a lot said by 2030, didn't they? Which would be only 5 years ago. And you look back and see how much progress they'd made, that would be almost none.
I was reading the other day that Google's commitment to net zero by whatever year it was, I think it was 2030, but it might have been a different one. That commitment has silently disappeared, or not quite disappeared, but is now extremely difficult to find.
Yeah, no, they've backtracked massively, haven't they? Because of the need, they're going to be burning loads of fossil fuels, to power their data center. They've just massively backtracked because they can make money out of it. I mean, look what BP was saying, just 2 or 3 years ago and what they're saying now, drill, baby, drill now. I mean, it is just like, it's not working. This idea that informed consumers are going to drive business towards behaving better just isn't working. I think regulation and taxation is the only thing that is going to work.
So another way of looking at this is, as Einstein said, which is that you can't solve a problem at the level of thinking that it was created. In other words, we need to go to another level. We need to go, in terms that I would use, to a level. We need to raise our consciousness. We need to go meta-conscious. We need to get a higher level of awareness, a level at which we understand and we see very clearly the interconnectedness, the interdependence of not only between us and all members of humanity, but also with the natural world. And going to that higher level, because of what we were talking about earlier before we came on air, about how there is hardly a decision made on the planet that doesn't have a commercial angle to it. There used to be commerce, business, and then you would have the church, and you would have education, and you would have healthcare, and they were generally not in the market. They were professions. But now everything is in the market. There's virtually nothing. And there are no counterbalances to the market because religion has now taken a backseat. Churches are not as influential. There aren't the kind of cultural strongholds around the planet that there used to be. And indeed, many of the governments are now becoming captured by business interests. So what is the future? Well, how about the future is that unless we raise our consciousness, unless we become meta-conscious, unless we rise to a higher level of understanding and wisdom, then we're just going to carry on down the same track. And where does that start other than with leadership? And given that so much of what happens on the planet is business, where else would it start best than with business leadership?
I would agree with you, but I mean, I think the question is how? I mean, I was asked a few months ago to give a talk at I don't know what it was. It was a big food conference in London, £1,000 a ticket thing or something. And the guy who was up before me was the CEO of, I think it was Danone Europe or Danone UK. And he gave an absolute bullshit speech, ending up with the assertion that that the link between ultra processed food and health was unclear, and that's why they couldn't do anything about it. And there were maybe 1,000 people in the room, and no one said anything. I mean, I can't think that there's any area of nutritional science where the link is more clear and more unanimously agreed by nutritionalists than that. He could just barefaced lie, and no one said anything. And what's more, I think he probably on some level believed it himself. So until we have some sort of honesty and people really be prepared to hold people to account in that way, I don't suppose he was a monster, but I mean, his actions were monstrous. So how do we, I think honesty is so important.
So,
Mike Berners-Lee has just written a book on it, actually, which has some very good stuff in it.
what's he talking about?
Honesty in business, basically. I'm trying to remember no, I can't remember. The Mike Berners-Lee is the author.
Yeah, okay.
Googled it's his latest book. He wrote How Bad Is Bananas, which I think is an absolutely brilliant book on the carbon footprint of everything. His that we live in such a complex world that unless we have higher standards of integrity and honesty from our politicians, media, and business, we don't have a future, really. I mean, we really need to start harnessing some of that wisdom, and without, and it's just too easy to lie and not be held to account. So why wouldn't you, if you can lie and say you're doing the right thing and, for your brand and so on, and that costs, a hundredth as much as it actually costs to do the right thing? Well, I'm afraid most people are just going to, do the window dressing, the lying, rather than actually do the action. And that's where we are. Climate of Truth. That's what the book's called.
Excellent title. Excellent title. So, yeah, the qualities of enlightened leadership would include integrity, honesty, as you said, openness, tolerance. I mean, a lot of the things, Guy, that you have.
Well, I think inclusion, diversity, inclusion in decision making.
Yeah.
We are much stronger for having a staff co-owner council who are really, invaluable. I would say it's sometimes holding the mirror up to the board. And they're very ethically driven. So yeah, and I think that is very important. Sorry, I interrupted you, Greg.
Well, not at all, because that was a very important point. But I mean, coming back to your point, you say, look, you'd be as 20 million is not going to make you any happier than 6 million. That recognition in itself is extremely valuable. If we all kind of got that, and we set our sights more on something that was wholesome and something that was aligned with our own purpose of seeking happiness rather than seeking status, or believing that status was the route to happiness.
Yeah, it's extraordinary how the myth of money and ego, persists, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because, everything says that it doesn't make you any happier beyond a certain level. I can't remember. It used to be said to be 55,000. It's probably 100,000 now that, that it makes no difference. So why are we so wedded to it? Your children aren't going to love you anymore because you give them an inheritance. Far from it, actually. I could say from experience, they'll love you less. You're not going to be happier in having two houses rather than one. You'll just have a lot of stress, looking after them, let alone the, social and environmental consequences of it. I mean, but yeah, we're still sort of wedded to it. I mean, that we've got to have everything. And, I count myself in that. I've still got way too much stuff. And it just weighs me down.
Do you find that your leadership and the values that you espouse, do you find that they in some way wash off on other people that you work with and other people at Riverford?
I'm not really noticeably. It's possible. I think we could be more radical. I'd like us to be more radical. And if we sort of projected an image of being more radical, I think we would attract more radical people who would behave in a more radical way. The actual style of Riverford is the way we do things is in some ways it's quite conventional. And I think we could be braver, which is a word that is being used quite a lot the last year or so. And we need to, convert it from just being a word to actually being some actions and I think a willingness to sort of take some risks. I think that the culture is it used to be that I did all that stuff. I came up with all the crazy ideas and broke all the rules and, and I think, fortunately, unfortunately, that, there's quite a long legacy that a leader leaves. And I think, I've made, because I occupied that space, I think I've made it quite difficult for other people to occupy it. And maybe in some ways I need to get the hell out of the way and, give people the opportunity to fill it. But there is obviously the danger of a vacuum in the interim. So, I mean, that's something that we are quite conscious of and debating and playing with at the moment.
So if we take honesty for a moment, Guy,
Yeah.
you're brutally honest. How do you hold that line for a higher purpose, even when it's uncomfortable? Because there are plenty of people in business. What advice would you give to leaders who feel torn, for instance, between demands for profit and their values?
Well, I think thinking long term, if you think long term, the things tend to come. If you have a long enough view, the demands of our planet and the demands of shareholders probably converge a little bit. So having a long term view, I think, is important, and having an ownership structure that supports a long term view. So that is definitely not, being owned by venture capitalists. So either being employee owned or family owned, or just having long term shareholders, as is absolutely the norm in Germany and in much of Europe. I mean, this sort of voracious short-term capitalism is really something that is really only seen in the UK and the US, as far as I understand. So a long-term view, I think, is really important. And Greg, I'm sorry, I've forgotten what your question was. I just went off on one there. So
No,
can you track me back?
I personally think that that's a really valid one, because there is so much short-termism, and if we brought in the longer term, we'd go, hey, hang on a second, this is crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the question was really is how do you hold your ground with radical honesty and for a higher purpose when it's uncomfortable?
Well, I think transparency is quite a good one. It's hard to lie to the people who really know the business inside out, the people who work within it. And if you empower them, they will insist on you being honest. They absolutely will not stand for duplicity, in my experience. So I think our staff council is quite a good means. People conveniently forget, for instance, that we did say we would be all electric vehicles for delivery. I'm fairly sure we said we were going to do it by 2024, and we're still only 70%. And I think just being not just sort of conveniently forgetting what you've said. So actually having some sort of check that you are actually delivering on what you said you'd deliver is pretty important. And it's okay to get it wrong. It's okay that we didn't make it. There were very good reasons why it was almost impossible, given the inadequacies of our national grid, to deliver that. And that's okay. We can say that, and we can explain why, and why the national grid has to improve. I think just being honest, admitting to your mistakes.
And if you if you set yourself challenging targets, then there's always going to be a chance that you'll miss them. And if there's no chance that you'll miss them, then you haven't been very challenging.
Well, but I think it is important to go back and revisit it and check that you've been honest. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan. Fellow autistics, Greta Thunberg and Chris Packham and stuff. They say stuff, that really needs to be said. This is, words ain't enough. We need action. Stop lying.
Yeah, thank you. If we just explain to the viewers that the change of scene is because you needed to reconnect your computer your laptop so as to recharge it. So you now have a different background. Abracadabra.
Abracadabra.
Taking a different tack, if you were to redesign the role of business in society and say business in society needs to what? What non-negotiable principles would you embed in that new vision?
Well, as I said before, I mean, in industrial democracy, i.e., including a broader range of people in decision making, I think is a pretty good way to ensure that a business is B, honest, and B, serving all its stakeholders. So, obviously staff, but customers and the environment. Because my experience is that ethical standards outside the boardroom are normally a lot higher, actually. I don't know what happens inside boardrooms. I'm not saying that directors are all bad people, but there is a sort of suspension of reality somehow. I don't know. People seem to be willing to do really awful things, in the pursuit of profit or to serve their shareholders, or, I know a lot of directors are incentivized by, share option schemes and and so on. Maybe that leads to it. But I mean, some truly hideous things have been done. I think, fossil fuel companies probably come near the top of that, but there have been lots of other examples. Doing things that I think if people went home and, explained to their children, what they'd done today, I think their children would be pretty horrified.
There was somebody guy who I was talking to not long ago, and he was in a particular sector, active sector, and he's a nice guy, very generous. He'd been very helpful and so forth. And so I kind of felt that I was on safe ground. And I started expressing views about certain practices that were really not good practices that were happening in his sector, because I didn't think he would be doing it. He said, "No, I do that. That's what I do." And when I looked a little bit surprised, he shrugged his shoulders and he said, "Business is business."
Yeah, well, it's that thing of, how much do you compromise? I'm not going to claim that I've never compromised. I mean, most certainly have. I've done things that not that many, but I've done a few things that I feel a bit uncomfortable about. I think it's really important when you do something, when you're doing, say, okay, we shouldn't do this, but we got to do it because, we just wouldn't survive as a business otherwise. And I think just to sort of mark it and make sure that you revisit it, and check that it is, that so bad behavior doesn't become normalized.
Right.
And I mean, perhaps that's why the Catholics have to go and, confess their sins so that those sins don't become, normalized. I have no idea whether it works or not, but it feels a bit like that.
Okay. Well, look.
So I think it's important when Riverford sets a target that we say we're going to do something. If we don't do it, that's not necessarily the end of the world, but we need to understand why we didn't make it, why we set it, that target, was it too high, and review it and be, honest about why we haven't achieved it.
Any final thought to leave the listeners with today, Guy?
Well, I do think that as a leader, self-knowledge is incredibly important. So I think really understanding why you do what you do, it will help you make better decisions that will be better for you and that will be better for the planet, better for the people that you work with. So yeah, I think a degree of self-awareness is almost the responsibility of a leader.
Thank you. A great note to finish on. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, Guy, and your inspirational story. You continue to demonstrate a model of how leadership that's rooted in, I would say, in integrity can not only shape the businesses, but also can be an example for community and shape society and the future that we all have in common. And let's hope that more join you and we shape that future to be better than the trajectory that we're currently on at the moment. Thank you for your time. It's greatly appreciated. Be well.
Thanks, Greg.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. And if you did, please follow us, like us, share with friends and colleagues, and also leave a comment, because it's really useful for us to know what you're thinking as well. Until next week, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Be well.